computer. It's all yours, Richard.
Right. Audio, is that all right? Can you hear me?
All good.
All good? Okay. No, for some reason I can't see my buttons because oh, there we are. I just clear the recording window and I'll just put the first slide up on the slideshow, um, which is from beginning. Now you should have a full screen there. Is that all right? Okay. Thank you for that. So let's crack on. Greenland is a very topical subject at the moment, and that's basically the subject of what I'm going to present this evening. And I've got news for Mr. Trump. America was very interested in Greenland at the turn of the previous century, long before he was born. So it's not his idea. So what's this presentation all about? It concerns the mission and context of the British Arctic Air Routes expedition, a sort of factual summary, then an examination of the role of radio on the Bari and the equipment employed, and then a very interesting sequel. But I'm starting with how I got involved. The radio you see on the table in 2012 was given to me by a radio amateur by the name of Roger Davis, with the call sign ZS1 Juliet from Plettenberg Bay. And I used to have regular 40-meter contacts with him, and I shared an interest in vintage cars with him. And one day he said to me, "Would you like a radio?" I said, "What is it?" He said, "It's an old Eddystone." I said, "Yes, I'd like it very much indeed." I said, "I better check whether the museum's got one first, because it better go there. But if they've got one, then I really would like it." So I checked and they did have one. So it came to me, and this was the day I had a ceremonial unpacking. The gentleman on the left is Cliff, who is the founder president of the Antique Wireless Association of Southern Africa, call sign ZS6BOX. And we just got it out of its box. And on the table, you'll see a folder, and in it were some copies of the Shortwave magazine published by Eddystone. And one thing that caught my eye very early on in the piece was this page. And on the right, there was this picture, and it's the radio cabin of the British Arctic Air Routes expedition, who remained in the Arctic regions for 12 months. And this sort of whetted my appetite because, pardon me, further down the page, they list a number of expeditions on which Eddystone equipment was used. Now, there's a better version of this picture later on, but this is what kicked off my interest. And a few years later, I managed to get a copy of the journal of the expedition, and this is it. I tried to buy one on the usual channels, but the prices at £200 plus just made it prohibitive. So I was lucky to find this one on a bookshelf in Johannesburg in very good condition, all the drawings and photographs in super condition. And interestingly, inside the cover, there was this inscription. So it was a Christmas present in 1932 to a chap from either his wife or girlfriend. And it really made excellent reading. It's not what I would have expected an expedition journal to be. It read like a novel, but the reason for that emerged later on. So a lot of material in this presentation actually comes from this journal. Now, I first wrote about this expedition in Signal magazine in August 22, And then I subsequently did a presentation to the Long Island CW Club. And this is the third time that I presented the subject. So let's get an orientation as to the difference between the North Pole and the South Pole, because the South Pole was always the first focus of Arctic exploration. And of course, it's a massive landmass, the South Pole, whereas the North Pole's in the middle of the sea, in the Arctic Sea, and approximately equidistant between the Russian Northern Territories and Newfoundland and Baffinland. And it's about 700 miles north of the northernmost part of the largest island in the world, which is owned by or run by the smallest European country. Not quite the smallest, but Denmark is substantially bigger than Luxembourg, if you understand what I mean. So part of the problem with getting to the North Pole is certainly in the summer. You need a boat. In the winter, it's possible. In a good winter, it's possible to get there by motorized transport, as has been done. So there have been, and this is a big summary, a number of expeditions in the 20th century. The one I want to just comment on is the 1925 Macmillan expedition. This was a massive expedition involving a lot of units from the American Navy and 3 float planes. It was not a successful expedition. It was very acrimonious as to who did what and who was taking orders from whom. And the planes were a bit of a disaster in 1925. They were very primitive and really not up to the task. But the significance in radio terms is this expedition is where Collins made his name, because in the street, same street as Arthur Collins in Cedar Rapids, was a chap by the name of John Reinhardt, who was a renowned radio experimenter. And Collins was licensed at the age of 14, and they did some 20-meter propagation experiments and established that reliable communications could be obtained for distances greater than 700 miles. And John Reinhardt just happened to be appointed to this expedition as the radio operator, and Arthur Collins made the equipment. Now, Arthur Collins had another mate who had an electrical store, and he had a lathe, and he taught Collins how to use the lathe. And if you look at Collins's original equipment that he used on this expedition, he built the stuff for Reinhardt's and the stuff at his end, and it is so beautifully made. And of course, a lot of the components were made from scratch. So he used to take down the messages and go to the telegraph office and telegraph the National Geographic magazine in New York. And he hit the front page of the New York Times with this reliable communication. And I think that set Collins onto the road of success. One other I'm going to mention is the airship attempt in 1928. Umberto Nobili, he actually got to the North Pole. He was supposed to land. It was in winter, of course, and but the winds were too fierce, and he turned around and hit a headwind, and he crashed on the way back. But he was rescued. There was a film made of it called The Red Tent, and I think that's available on video. The other guy worth mentioning, who was in Greenland at the same time, but very much to the north, was Alfred Wegener, who was a German, and he had a mechanized expedition with snowmobiles and God knows what. And his claim to fame, he was the professor who proposed the tectonic plates theory of formation of the continents. But he died on the expedition. And of course, things were not very much encouraged that were German, and therefore it's not very well reported. Then there was our expedition I'm talking about today, and it's worth mentioning the Graf Zeppelin trip as well, which flew over our expedition while they were on the high seas heading towards Iceland. Right. There was a second expedition by four of men from our expedition, and that I'll deal with later. I could spend a lot of time talking about some of these things, but you can see where the Americans featured, and also British attempt in 68, 69, British explorer Wally Herbert made it on foot. And he actually made it right across the Arctic Ocean. Right, so here is the leader of our expedition, Gino Watkins. It was his brainchild. He was a very charismatic leader. He was a Cambridge engineering undergraduate. He never achieved his degree. He was too busy organizing expeditions. He was a pilot. He had been on two previous Arctic expeditions with one member of the current expedition, Scott, who was no relation to Scott of the Antarctic. Watkins' father was a colonel in the Coldstream Guards, which gave him a bit of status, but no money because he had a talent for finding dud investments. So he had to raise all the money for the expedition. The £12,000, which was raised, that's equivalent to, say, £750,000 today. It was raised on the back of a commercial prospect, as well as for its scientific merit, and you'll see that as we go along. In the late 1920s, three Cambridge academics, Wordie, Debenham and Priestley, used to lecture on their subjects, but frequently referred to their polar experiences, which they had together on Scott's Terra Nova expedition. And they co-founded the Scott Polar Research Institute in 1920, the SPRI. And they actively fostered polar expeditions and talent spotted for them. And Wordie was also a veteran of 9 polar expeditions by the time of his involvement with Bari. And he also mentored Watkins. So that's why I put the Cambridge crest up there. It was not a Cambridge University expedition. It was private and privately funded, but there were 10 out of 14 members who were current members of the university at the time. In addition, 4 seconded men were solicited to join the expedition through a committee set up by the Royal Geographical Society under the Prince of Wales patronage. And the chairman of this committee was Major Stephen Courtauld, who I think the Courtauld Foundation or family provided most of the funding. A very important member was Captain Rayner, who was a Royal Signals captain. The secretary was Courtauld's nephew, who was on the expedition, and he was also the treasurer, and of course Professor Wordie and Gino Watkins, the leader. The Royal Geographical Society was very generous in terms of its support, gave them an office to use, generous grant, loan of instruments, and training in cartography. Various government departments, the military contributed personnel and instruments, and many firms donated funds, food, and equipment. But the primary funding came from Courtauld, and the next biggest one was from Pan American Airways. Imperial Airways was not interested. Their focus was the colonial routes out to the Far East and down Africa. So here are the members of the expedition. Watkins, in addition to leading it, was also the chief hunter and the dietitian. A big thing was made of their diet because one of the failure factors of Scott of the Antarctic was there were insufficient calories in his diet to carry him forward over the journeys that he undertook. And you know the result of that. The medical officer was seconded. He from the Navy. Spencer Chapman, Freddie Spencer Chapman, wrote the journal. He was an ornithologist. He was a surveyor assistant. He ended up involuntary scribe because Watkins was planning another expedition, didn't have time to write it. So it has very much a flavour of the flora and fauna. Just can't remember his first name, but the Courtauld, the younger, was a surveyor. Cousins, very interesting chap, you'll hear later, was a photographer and also a pilot. Death was seconded from the RAF. He was the chief pilot and also a meteorologist. Hampton, ground engineer and pilot. Very important man here. Lemon, Captain Royal Signals, Lemon PH. He was the wireless operator, as they called him, but also the base camp manager. Lindsay, a surveyor. Quinton Riley, meteorologist. Rymel, he was a surveyor and a pilot. He was seconded. Scott was the sled dog driver and a survey assistant, and he had been on 2 Arctic expeditions with Watkins before. The only other guy who had been on an Arctic expedition at all was August Courtauld. I remembered his first name. So there are only 3 out of the 14 had ever been in the Arctic, which was very interesting. Stevenson, chief surveyor, and Wager, the geologist. So the mission of the expedition was to investigate the possibility of a new and shorter air passage between Great Britain and Canada. The proposed route would cross the Arctic via the Faroes, Iceland, Greenland, Baffin Island, and Hudson Bay, destination Winnipeg. Now, here's a representation of the route from the journal. And there was absolutely nothing in Ireland, in Greenland. The maps of the East Coast were extremely inaccurate. The West Coast were not very much better, but from a dotted line which ran along the coast, they knew nothing about the interior. Nobody had been there, or nobody had recorded any experience of having been there. So it was one of the last places on Earth, really, where man, including the Eskimos, or the Inuit, as I'll call them from here on, feared to tread because they had beliefs that the place was inhabited by devils and all sorts of things. And of course, it was a hell of a mission to get up from the coast level up onto the the polar ice cap. Watkins negotiated the charter of the Quest. Now, the Quest was the ship which Shackleton had on his last voyage, and he died aboard the Quest in North of Georgia Island. I'll say it again, north of South Georgia Island. And it was a wooden ship with a round bottom. It was a sealer, but absolutely ideal for Arctic conditions because it couldn't be trapped in the ice. It was a very strong ship. And it was really quite a coup to be able to get hold of this historic, by then, historic boat for the voyage. So 13 members set off from St. Catherine's Dock, London, in the Quest in July 1930. On board, they had one of 2 de Havilland Moths, 2 motorboats, and a mountain of stores, equipment, fuel, and personal baggage. But there was more to come. The first call was the Faroes to rendezvous with the 14th man, Scott, who had gone ahead to purchase 50 sled dogs in West Greenland. So that was an interesting addition to the mix. The last stopover was Iceland, where they were able to top up with forgotten items, and then across the pack ice to the Danish administered Eskimo settlement on the East Greenland island of Anglisalik for arrival formalities. Now, the local government representative was a doctor. He also operated the radio station, and between him and his wife, they administrated the place. And the formalities was just a question of dropping their trousers for a VD inspection. And once cleared, they were allowed to proceed on their way, because Greenland was free of venereal diseases at the time. So on the Quest, they went looking for a suitable base camp, the best compromise of access from the sea, level, elevated radio-friendly site, a lagoon for float plane operations, and easy access up onto the ice cap. So here's the picture of them unloading. They anchored in the fjord, and everything was sent across in these boats and ported up the slope onto the mini plateau where the hut was constructed. The hut was a pre-cut kit, if you like, and the ship's carpenters took a week to put this thing together. It wasn't easy going. They worked 12 shifts for a week to ferry the materials up to the site. They had to row across 200 yards of water and ported the stores, including sacks of coal and a ton of whale meat, food for the dogs, up to the site of the hut, which was a Norwegian hunter's hut, a special design, suitable for living accommodation. It could take with a squeeze all of them in the hut. So in the next year, they did 7 significant journeys, during which surveying was conducted and meteorological observations recorded. They're depicted here on the map. You can see the coverage, amazing distances that they traveled. The first journey was a 200-mile survey of the coastline from Anglisalik north to Kangerlussuaq, and that was completed and mapped using the Quest, the motorboats, and aircraft for aerial photographs of the complete coastal strip between the ice cap and the coast. In addition to mapping, geological and ornithological surveys were made. The second journey was very significant. It was the ice cap journey, and the route was up a very steep bank over a glacier to the permanent ice where a depot had been established, marked with a big flag. As they travelled, the route to the site for the ice cap station was marked with flags on the northwesterly compass bearing to a position 120 miles inland from the base at an altitude of 8,000 feet. So a couple of chaps were left to establish the base and also to take meteorological observations. And the rest of the party went south, following the highest part of the ice cap, returning to camp. So that was a 370-mile trip. Then things started to go wrong. And again, I say the description reads like a thriller novel in the journal. On a journey to relieve the two chaps at the ice station, extreme weather occurred, and they actually dumped an awful lot of stuff at a nominated flag, and the party split up. Three got to the ice cap camp, and then Courtauld stayed, and the others returned to base. Then a subsequent journey to relieve Courtauld in March and April 1931 failed to locate the ice cap camp due to the fact they didn't have a time signal radio, so they didn't know where their longitude was. It's believed they missed it by about 150 yards, but by this time, of course, it had snowed and covered the place up, and everything was very difficult to see. Eventually, Spencer Chapman and Reinald Watkins managed to reach Courtauld after 150 days alone, entombed in the snow. Now, that's escalated to an international incident. There was a contract with the Daily Mail, so some of the radio messages were directed to them, and they were given the running commentary of what was going on. There were great fears for Courtauld's life. There were several aircraft sent out, but it was just impossible to see, as you'll see from the next slide, from the air, because from August 1930, it progressively got covered up, and the only thing that was projecting out of the snow when they found him was the Union Jack. And he stuck that up his breathing pipe. So it was just an incredible bit of good navigation and also grit and determination to rescue him. So this is what he looked like when he came out, when he was dug out. And this is where he lived. And he was actually entombed. He couldn't get out. He was frozen in. So, and he was down to his last teaspoon of paraffin, and you can read it in the journal. It's quite a near thing. The third journey and attempt was made to sledge across, to go north in the early spring, and that failed to extreme blizzard conditions. They had to turn back. Another journey to the Mount Forel area, that's up the coast, up the east coast, to the mountainous area, and they managed to climb Mount Forel, but didn't summit because there was an overhanging ice cap. But they got within 300 or 400 feet of the summit. It was the highest height ever reached in the Arctic. Then the fifth journey, the ice cap was crossed from the base down to the eastern edge of the ice cap. The sixth journey was across the ice cap to Holsteinborg on the west coast. And this was the first time that they used this form of travel. Kayaks were carried on the sledges for the last 90 miles of the 470-mile journey by sea. So the longest journey was number 7. That was from the base around the southeast coast to Julian Harbour on the west coast in 2 18-foot open whaleboats with outboard engines. And detailed mapping was done on the first 140 miles. And a 40-mile long island was discovered. The total journey length was 560 miles. Altogether, the expedition mapped 350 miles of coastline and obtained an approximate idea of the inside border of the mountains for 150 miles. So it was a huge achievement. Just digressing now, the emergence of the radio amateurs. This was all fairly recent at the time of the expedition, because from 1924, amateur radio was adjusting to the segregation of their frequencies from commercial and professional exploitation. And the emergence of strong societies through their technical publications helped amateurs to comply with the tighter regulations on frequency control and discipline. So the emergence of quartz resonators and also more stable oscillators like the Pierce oscillator were regularly published in QST. It's interesting how expensive crystals were in the early days, but once QST published how you could homebrew them, it opened the floodgates of amateur experimentation. And in fact, the developments ran well ahead of the professionals. Amateur radio was the first sizable commercial market for crystals, and of course that brought prices within reason. Many of the crystal companies of the period were founded by amateur radio operators. At the end of the decade, the TNR bulletin of the RSGB listed 4 of these suppliers in the UK. It was also a very exciting time. And there was great optimism for British and American people. It was the era of airships, electric gramophones, jazz, the Charleston, the talkies, a massive expansion of broadcast radio from 1923, where, of course, Collins made his money. The media fostered the Roaring Twenties, the film The Flaming Youth, starring Jazz Baby Colleen Moore, sparked off a new fashion trend. The bob or pageboy style required no hairpins. And manufacturer Stratton & Co.'s market for a staple product dwindled overnight from 6 tons to 1. They were in the business of costume jewelry, which was made by the lost wax method, but they also had a staple trade or manufacturing base of hairpins. And of course, this hairstyle didn't require any. So it was sufficiently serious that the collapse of sales was countered by a move into manufacture of radio components. And this generated the Eddystone brand, and A.B. Lawson, his son Stratton, was very much into the radio craze of the era. And it's interesting that during the First World War, that firm had manufactured parts for the engine of the SE-5 fighter. It was a licensed Hispano-Suiza engine with very fine aluminium castings, and they acquired much experience on production of them. And this know-how reflected in many of the company's future designs, including the radio that I'm going to talk about on the expedition. Sorry. Another important fact was that in this migration into manufacturing radio components, some amateurs were recruited into the company. Harold Cox to become technical director, Arthur Edwards, G6XJ, later director and general manager. On the commercial side, and George Brown, G5BJ, who later became a senior transmitter engineer. In 1927, the company's products shifted towards shortwaves and kit radios. Now, Edwards was very much into the expedition scene. He saw that as a very good way to promote their shortwave radio products, and he built the equipment for use by an Oxford University expedition to British Guiana. That was mentioned in the shortwave manual as well. There was a 50-watt main transmitter for DX working back to the UK, and a 10-watt transmitter as a means of contact between the survey party and the base camp. Both of these portable stations worked on 7 and 14 megahertz. Edwards was a keen yachtsman and took the transmitters around the Norfolk Broads of the British East Coast for tests between July 27 to August 10, 1929, using a special call sign XG6XJ. Turning our thoughts to the wireless operator on the expedition, when you read the journal, one is struck by the frequency and variety of reference to radio communications and signals. However, no technicalities are mentioned, probably because the author, Spencer Chapman, had little knowledge of it. At the centre of the author's research was Percy Lemon, included in the expedition complement of scientists, but titled the wireless operator. Now there he is, not quite the most sartorial guy on the planet, and he was a bit older than the general run of people on the expedition. He was 33, 10 years older than the average age of the expedition members. He saw service in France in World War I. He experimented with wireless since 1914. He had a military career of secondment to tank regiments and mechanized brigades. Then he went up to Cambridge to read for a mechanical sciences degree. And while he was there, he participated in the Cambridge University Officers Training Corps Signal Unit, which would have brought him into contact with amateur radio, which were used in competitions with the Oxford OTC signal section. The connections would have been made at Cambridge with the expedition scene at both universities, the Eddystone supporters named before, the equipment suppliers to the university laboratories, and Gino Watkins in particular. Needless to say, he was very keen to go on the expedition, and I think the signals, the Royal Signals were very keen too, to gain some experience about communication from the ice cap. His expedition responsibilities began with acquisition of all the necessary radio equipment, spare parts and consumables, and that rapidly extended into training many of the expedition members to operate it. He has the distinction of being the first member of the expedition to be injured. It was less than 24 hours after departure. They hadn't even got out of the Thames estuary. And at a farewell party aboard Major Courtaulds' yacht, he was bitten by a pet lemur on the hand, incising an artery, which put Bingham, the surgeon's suturing skills, to the test. The quest was very crowded during the voyage to East Greenland. Lemon would have put the time to good use and made himself handy in the ship's wireless operating room, while gaining knowledge of maritime operating procedures, frequencies, and equipment capability. He was also the first guy to fall out with Watkins over Watkins' ultra-democratic leadership style, which was generally accepted by the others. Now, you've got to understand, a lot of those guys were still students. He, at that point, requested written orders and he would get on with the job. Watkins had other ideas which would prove to be right. Transfer of know-how between members, delegation of responsibility, and consensus decision-making undoubtedly saved lives because nobody was seriously injured and nobody lost their life on this expedition. Lemon was highly capable with his hands and executed tasks in a neat and clever way. He was left on his own at the base camp during the first two journeys to keep meteorological observations, to get all the wireless equipment destined for the ice cap working. His period of isolation was a time for reflection and transition to acceptance of the expedition norms and Watkins' style of leadership, quite difficult for a top-down military type man. Here's a picture of erecting the aerial masts either side of the huts. One is up, the other one's on the ground, and he used a gin pole to erect them. When Scott's Ice Cap party and the Quest Survey party under Watkins departed, the hut was finished, so it had been constructed, but it was absolutely bare. When they returned to base, they were greeted by heating, electric light, everything with a stowage, immaculate Inuit staff who cleaned, laid table, washed up, and were engaged in darning and sewing. They were astonished to hear him address the servants in fluent Inuit, to discover that he devised a system to learn their language without a word of English on their side. He was not the most sartorial individual, but he was attracted to the Inuit women and had a relationship with one, as did three others. Cousins showed some aptitude for radio construction, and with Lemon's tutelage, using some of the extensive stock of spare parts, he built a receiver to receive the BBC Daventry on 3,000 metres. The BBC became aware of their daily tune-in to the news and broadcast messages to them. He learnt to kayak to the extent of rolling 360 and participated in hunting, surveying, and more general exhibition activities. He took part in later ice cap journeys, and the 7th journey would have come to grief without his participation. The 560-mile journey down the Greenland east coast in 2 open boats powered by outboard engines was full of mishaps. On this, they continued the coastal survey from the base down to Univik. Lemon did the plane tabling survey and Courtauld the astronomical work. Lemon left Greenland ahead of the rest to return to his unit stationed at Catterick. He was plagued by mastoiditis and associated insomnia after his return, occasioned by the extremely harsh physical conditions of the last journey at the onset of the Arctic winter. His next posting to Palestine was cancelled due to his indisposition. He was due to take over the Hong Kong signal section. In June 32, he collapsed at St Pancras Station. It was found that he'd ingested undiluted zinc chloride, commonly used as a disinfectant in diluted form. Although twice operated on, peritonitis ensued, and he died at St Bartholomew's Hospital on 24th October 1932, aged 34. His death was recorded by the coroner as by misadventure, and his name was given to the Lemon Range of mountains in eastern Greenland. The call sign of the base radio station, licensed by the Danish, was GKN. The intended principal radio link for the expedition was to station GKM at the government wireless station in Aldershot, responsible to Captain Rayner. This link was too sporadic for reliable communications, and often messages were relayed by amateur radio stations. Rayner wrote extensively about the expedition in the wire, but made no reference to communications. Lemon also made contact with amateurs, which was encouraged by the ARRL, who supported the monitoring of radio transmissions for expeditions, and QST ran a series of detailed schedules for American operators. The identity of the UK amateurs involved was kept confidential, but a letter from Barbara Dunn, G6YL, to the TNR Bulletin in October 30 left no doubt that such contacts were made. Regarding the British Air Routes expedition on board the Quest, I have been officially informed that the PMG states that GKN will not be able to work with amateur stations in future, as by so doing, etc., etc. So it's obvious that she did have contact with the expedition. Now, you can see how difficult my task has been. No reports, notes, diaries, or operational logs kept by Lemon have come to light. The start point was the Signals Museum, Royal Signals, and they were given a low probability of survival. His involvement on full pay would have been motivated on scientific experiment with radio propagation. And there's photographic evidence this was taking place. I'm devoid of definitive information about radio communications in the absence of material written by Lemon. References to radio operations in the journal and other publications merely record the events, not the means. Their frequency and variety indicates a higher level of capability than one would have associated with the time. These operations included communication with sledge-mounted mobile expedition stations, time signal reception and relays maintaining a base master chronometer, contacts with the two DH Moths throughout their flights on the expedition, regular communication with the Quest, contacts with many visiting and passing vessels, communication with a visiting Swedish Junkers aircraft, Captain Arenberg's Odin, deployed in the search for Courtauld, land station contacts with Iceland when conditions permitted, also with Europe, contacts with radio amateurs, and sending wires, i.e. telegrams, to keep members, relatives posted, and the times updated on expedition activities via a link to the government radio station at Umarsalik, the Danish seat of administration 25 miles in a direct line away. Lemon had struck up a friendship with the Danish government wireless operator. It was after his base camp visit that one of the Moths piloted by Cousins on the return journey was all but wrecked at its moorings when a gale blew up during the night. So here's a better version of that picture of the Radio Shack. Just picking up a few things. There's the main transmitter, a 50-watt transmitter. This is one of the 3-valve receivers, and that is on the right, sitting on top of what appears to be a couple of drawers containing coil sets, I would think, and beneath that 3 batteries, which made up the HT battery, is the Eddystone All-Wave 4. And that had an output valve in it, so you can see the speaker at the top. There's various bits of equipment. There's a wave meter, some spares, coils. So they were relatively well equipped. And of course, there was a complete duplicate set, transmitter and receiver, taken with the expedition for the ice cap station. And of course, that was offloaded when they got into difficulties in bad weather. So the main transmitter is described as a modified RAF Type 57 with CW only, input of 100 watts from a DC generator. Let's just go back. Read this. There, I don't know if you can see the generator under the shelf. Its shaft is poking through the shed, and it was driven by a petrol engine, shaft driven from the outside. So the engine was outside and the generator was inside for the HT supplies to the transmitter. On top, so I've described all the equipment in the picture. Yes, the 10-watt transmitters were also RF origin, but I don't know much about those other than they were crystal controlled on 7 and 14 megahertz. Here's some contemporary advertising from Carter Brothers, who supplied crystal oscillators and wave meters and crystals, and they were involved in the modification of the transmitters for the expedition. It's very likely that the circuitry used was the circuitry used by Arthur Edwards in the transmitters he made the previous year for the Oxford expedition. And here's a quick view of the circuit of that transmitter. The final valve was a DO40 BA tube, and the LS5 was introduced in 1923. So it all ties together. This circuit was published in the shortwave manual, Eddystone shortwave manual. So it's largely probably what Lemon based his construction on. That's somewhat conjecture on my part, but the evidence seems to add up to that. The receiver, the Eddystone All-Wave 4, was the main receiver. It was interestingly made in a die-cast aluminium box, and the lid is held on by the screw on top, and it can be screwed down and hermetically sealed. It was extremely strong, water and vermin and insect tight. All the components were tropicalized, and it was first demonstrated at Olympia in 1930, September 1930, where its selection by the Bari was used as a marketing point. And of course, it was made available through all the colonial outfitters, because these chaps would come in. It was quite expensive. If you look at the price, £27, that was probably 2 months' salary for an artisan in those days. And it was beyond the reach of most people domestically, but with the colonial allowance, of course, along with the pith helmet and all the rifles you needed to take up a colonial appointment, one of these would be included in the kit. And that's why very few are found in the United Kingdom, and more, although they are rather scarce, are found all around the world. So here's a detailed look. The launch model featured, it's a TRF with reaction, with an RF stage, with plug-in coils to change the waveband. It had independent tuning, the first model, with Indigraph dials. And then the bottom left is the RF compartment. And along the top, we have the detector and the AF. And then, of course, the coils were color-coded according to the band of operation. Spare coils could be purchased, even blank formers. And I was lucky to get a good selection of these with the radio that I got. I think the blank formers were used to wind coils for the time signals from Droitwich. But anyway, the next iteration, this is my radio, had gang tuning with a balancing trimmer. This was a more successful tuning method, and but everything else was the same. The circuitry, all they did was a little bit of mechanical change to gang the tuning, and the logging readout was on a single dial. Quite a modern concept, really. It did not have a grid bias battery. The tubes were auto biased with a bleed from the HT battery. The third version of the receiver was rebranded the All World 4. It was still dubbed the AW4. This is also my set, and its price had gone up to £45. It was externally identical to the second series. The castings were thinner, they'd been production engineered. The coils were smaller, but basically still the same circuit. Only difference, an improved variable mu pentode was used in the RF stage. And this is my redraft of the circuit diagram of the one with the gang tuning. Then some of the promotional literature. They produced also a mains-powered one using 4-volt valves. And in kit form, this loudspeaker, which the legs could come off and it would pack flat. So they really put a lot of design, and it's worth mentioning that the original Allwave 4 was the first complete radio that Eddystone produced. Up until then, they'd only produced components and kits. And here was the only sketch I've got of the time signal receiver with the lid off. I think to get it in the transit case, I had to leave the lid off it. And this was used for navigational use on the sledge and boat journeys. And here's a picture of Lemon taking a time signal with one of the 3-valve Eddystone receivers. And its transport case is visible in the picture. Here, Stevenson is operating a portable transmitter on top of its transport box to report his position to base while on a sledging survey. At the front of the sledge, a mast with canvas wrapped around it serves to insulate the antenna wire, and it's coiled around it to provide a bit of base loading. And then you can see that it's strung to a ski which has been planted in the snow to elevate the antenna. Now, part of my problem is I can't read the bottom of the slides. But anyway, here's another antenna. This is a very interesting one. It has a capacity top hat. The portable transmitter is operating against a counterpoise wire. And they obviously found out fairly early on in the piece that the covering of snow, which had frozen, was a very good insulator and not a very good earth. So here you could see that the counterpoise had been deployed and was very necessary. Another shot operating the transmitter, I think. No, maybe the time signal receiver. Yeah, because there's no wire coiled around that. So you can see the antenna goes to the top here, then it's strung to somewhere, maybe the boat mast, because they're on the edge of the fjord. Right, so Lemon was extremely enamored of the performance, reliability, the Eddystone receivers. His telegram of congratulations was widely used by Stratton in advertising for both their Eddystone and Polar brands. Eddystone components were made of the very best materials and very high grade very high grade manufacture. And they found it was necessary to produce a cheaper range, the polar range, to capitalize on the expedition folklore, but also to prevent other competitors coming in with cheaper copies. Now, there was a sequel to the expedition. Watkins was planning the next expedition to sledge across the South Polar Plateau from the Weddell Sea to the Ross Sea with the objective to find out if Antarctica is one continent or two. An expedition on the same scale as Bari using aeroplanes. But he found that raising funds in the teeth of the recession proved demoralizing and impossible. Pan American Airways offered £500 towards a return visit to Greenland to complete the East Coastal Survey, continue investigation of flying conditions, and a total of £800 was raised in addition to that. Watkins, Riley, Rymel, and Spencer Chapman returned to the East Greenland coast with Rymel's motorboat, the Stella Polaris. On 20th August 32, Watkins, who'd been hunting alone in a kayak, suffered an inundation, which may have been due to a glacier calving, an iceberg tippling, interaction with wildlife, or a miscalculated angle shot at seal. He was hunting seal. The rest of the party came to the realization that Watkins was dead when his upended kayak was found with his rifle missing and his clothes spread out to dry on an ice floe. The remaining party of three agreed with Pan American Airways to continue the expedition with Rymel as leader as a tribute to Gino Watkins and a belief in the expedition's mission, which they completed in full. The expedition members had visited Lemon in hospital before departure and were aware that he was dying. Lemon's death occurred 6 weeks after Watkins. The 12 remaining members of Bari lived exceptional lives. All of them acquitted themselves well during World War II and survived to tell the tale. The Polar Medal was awarded to all of them by King George V, the first grant of the Medal for Arctic Service. So just the sequel for some of the members. Spencer Chapman was a school teacher. And he was called up from his post at Gordonston to command a guerrilla warfare school in Singapore. From there, he operated behind Japanese lines to organize reconnaissance and sabotage. He excelled in this role, spending 3.5 years in the Malayan jungle. He ended the war as a lieutenant colonel, awarded the DSO and bar. Including the 2 East Greenland journals, Chapman wrote a total of 8 books of an expeditionary and adventure nature. His illustrious life did not completely fulfill him. And faced with health and financial issues, he couldn't countenance retirement and shot himself at the age of 64. Scott became a prolific author. He was a huge rugby playing man. He was a prolific author, 35 titles to his name, spread evenly between facts and fiction. He wrote the Journal of the Labrador Expedition, and his second book was a biography of Watkins, which I've got a copy of. Scott married Watkins' sister, Pam. In the war, he joined the 5th Scots Guards Ski Battalion, was later an instructor at the SOE training school in the Scottish Highlands. He ended the war as a commander of Mountain Warfare School in the Apennines and was awarded the OBE in 1945. He died at the age of 79 after an accident climbing an apple tree. Lindsay, he wrote a book about Bari, published in 1932, Those Greenland Days, really worth reading. In 1934, he led the successful British Trans-Greenland expedition. He rejoined the army in 1939 and made a significant contribution to the Norwegian campaign. He had an illustrious army career, was wounded in action, received the DSO, and ended the war as a lieutenant colonel. He had a controversial political career as a Conservative MP post-war. He was awarded a baronetcy, a hereditary knighthood in 1962, and died aged 75 and 75. So a very colourful character. Courtauld, the chap who got marooned on the ice cap, he tried to retreat from his fame, keeping a low profile. I don't think he was short of a bob or two. But he was a member of a party to make the first ascent of the highest mountain in the Arctic in 1935. He served as a RNVR officer in the war, specializing in using canoes for limpet mine attacks in Arctic waters. So he spent much of his later life at sea yachting. He served as High Sheriff of Essex for a year, but he became ill with multiple sclerosis and he died at a young age from the complications. Bingham, the surgeon, remember, he had the distinction of being decorated 3 times for polar service. He got a second class clasp to his Bari Medal in 1939 for Antarctic service, and a third class for Antarctic service later on. During the Second World War, he was surgeon commander at Royal Naval Hospital in Plymouth. He then served on HMS Duke of York as principal medical officer, received the OBE in 1947, retired in 1957 as principal medical officer with the rank of surgeon captain at the Royal Naval Air Station. So he lived to the ripe old age of 92. Cousins, a very interesting connection here. More than 1,000 photographs, mostly as glass plate negatives, taken by Cousins. He took some movie as well, and they're all archived at the SPRI. So after Bari, he joined number 25 Squadron as a fighter pilot. He then flew flying boats and saw service in Iraq. In 1937, he was appointed commanding officer of 19 Squadron, based at RAF Duxford, and oversaw the introduction of the Spitfire, the first squadron to receive them. He got the Air Force Cross the following year. When war broke out, he was considered too old for active service. He was given a desk job, but he didn't last very long and secured the post of commanding officer at RAF Henswell, the bomber base of Polish 305 Squadron in Lincolnshire. And there's the connection with my father, who was also with the Polish Squadron in Lincolnshire, and he was the Polish liaison officer, Polish Air Force liaison officer. Shortly afterwards, he converted to fly Wellington bombers, soon active in raids over Germany. He also took a lot of film while he was flying, but of course it was all classified for 25 years. He was made a companion of the Order of Bath. His film eventually was shown on BBC television in 1978. Retired with the rank of Air Commodore and died at the ripe old age of 91 years old. He was quite a charismatic character. Death, the chief pilot, He became de facto the world's foremost expert on light aircraft operations under Arctic conditions. He ended up as Air Vice Marshal. Then he went into the ministry and was ordained as a deacon. And from then, that was in 1957, and from then until his death at age 85, he was a curate and later priest in charge. So there's a man with many talents. Hampton, I don't know much about, but he was on the next expedition with some of his mates to Antarctica, and they had a de Havilland Fox aeroplane, and he was also a full participant. I have no information on his war service. Rymel was an Australian, and he went on the Antarctic expedition with Hampton, Stevenson, and Bingham, and it really was a success. He also got a class to his polar medal. He did the journal on the expedition. It was called Southern Lights as a tribute to the Northern Lights title. And he was a commissioned officer. He died at 63 as a result of a car accident. Here's one of my favorites, Quintin Theodore Petrop Molesworth Riley. He was an SOE special operations man. It was the brainchild of Ian Fleming of James Bond fame to execute the butcher and bolt raids behind enemy lines. And in the Italian campaign, old Riley was well in there. Like many SOE operatives, he could receive no honours. He also died in a road accident. It must have been bad drivers, age 75. Stevenson held the polar altitude record with Wager, the Mount Foral climb that they did. He stayed connected all his life with polar exploration. During the war, he was a chief instructor at the Central Allied Photo Interpretation Unit. He was an OBE. He lectured at Imperial College London. He for many, many years, 40 years, was the honorary secretary of the Antarctic Club. And he died at age 81. And he had two mountains named after him in both the Arctic and Antarctica. Wager was the geologist, if you remember. He made a significant contribution to the science of petrology, how rocks are formed. Made 3 further expeditionary visits to Greenland. 2 unsuccessful attempts on Everest. Nearly made it. During the Second World War, he worked in the photographic interpretation section as well. Yeah, and he was a member of a small reconnaissance team attempting to track down the Tirpitz. So he ended the war as a flight lieutenant. He was appointed to the chair of geology at University of Durham, fellow of the Royal Society, and appointed professor of geography at Oxford. He made another expedition to Greenland in 53, but he had a heart attack in 55, and that put an end to his career as an explorer. His academic work continued, and he really made some significant contributions to geological age determination and isotope geochemistry. But he sadly died at a young age of 61 of a heart attack. So the conclusions are that the Bari was an unqualified success with a legacy of superior maps of the Greenland east coastal region. The expedition enjoyed unprecedented service from radio links, its portable HF radio equipment, and the 2 de Havilland Moth aircraft. I think they did 52 hours of flying between the two aircraft, mostly on one aircraft because one was damaged and was out of commission for about 6 months. The illness and demise of Lemon directly afterwards undoubtedly robbed the world of some leading-edge know-how concerning HF communications in the polar environment, a setback to later expeditions. The Bari experience brought forth the best performance of each member, without exception, and fashioned strong bonds within the group, some of which endured a lifetime. The compulsive risks and rewards of polar adventure continued on in several members. The Bari experience translated into exemplary military contributions to the Allied World War II effort. Thank you for watching and listening. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have talking about it.
Richard, thank you so much. I thought that was absolutely fascinating. I wonder if I might just ask one quick question also. It's quite interesting, isn't it, how people are driven to these extremes, to just want to go to these sort of lengths and push their endurance and abilities, what have you. I mean, even today, people do it. So it's obviously a human characteristic. A question I've got really is about the antennas. I know you said there was very little as regards technical detail, but I'm actually quite fascinated by how they managed with fairly simple antennas, because I imagine they weren't directional. I also imagine that being in the Arctic, you really had to rely on ground wave, because I imagine Skywave or anything else would probably just, well, go out into space and that'd be that. So it's interesting to know whether you could find anything at all that talked about the antennas, the performance antennas, and whether there was anything that was learnt by the expedition on how antennas in such a harsh environment performed.
It's a jolly good question. It's one that's occupied my mind since I got my teeth into this subject. Now, the research that I conducted was over 13 years, not continuously. I'd pick it up, put it down, get the new book, get some more information. And really, in the absence, as I said on one slide, of information directly from Lemon himself, it's very, very hard because none of the others, apart from Cousins, who built that one radio under the tutelage of Lemon, nobody else. They were just following instructions, and there were no comments passed, or I had to place the ski 20 feet from the sled, or this sort of detail is absent. And I think even if Watkins had written the journal, we still wouldn't have had those details. They would have been in Lemon's notes and papers. And it looks like he was fairly blighted with this, with the residue of that journey, that 650-mile journey. And he never really recovered from that. And of course, then there was an accident, believed to be an accident, where the disinfectant, which he would have had to gargle or whatever he did, he accidentally ingested the full strength stuff, and that caused him irreparable damage. And I should imagine that, well, he certainly, the Royal Signals people that I spoke to, I had extensive correspondence with them. And after I gave them a copy of the article, they said, well, this is a fine piece of work, which was a big compliment, but the deductions that I've made by piecing together timing and crossovers and activities and so on gave probably the most information in one place that anybody's got on what transpired on that expedition. Now, I do know by inference that modern telemetry across the ice cap, which of course is digital modulation, but they use HF radio. There's a very good reason for that, that they can't use satellites because of the latitude, they are out of view of the geostationary satellite belt. So they still, to this day, use HF, and they use, for short hops up to 350 kilometers, they use inverted Vs, very low inverted Vs. And I know just from scrutinizing the photographs, you saw those two poles that were put up either side of the hut. That was a doublet. There's no doubt in my mind that that was a doublet. But it was a base-loaded short wire, I think, for the mobile antennas on the boat. And you saw that one with the top hat and the counterpoise. I think there was a lot of experimentation going on. And the big miracle, of course, is how they picked up the VLF time signals. I mean, I have no information to support it, but I doubt that they picked up the 16 kilohertz signal, but there was at that time a 60 kilohertz signal, and that probably would have been receivable with as much wire as you could lay out, because especially on the ice cap itself, it was an insulator, you know, so all you had to do was lay it out on the ground almost, and get some antenna effect. So I can't answer the question. It remains a very interesting question. I think the science of it was set back with Lemon's death. I think he knew an awful lot, and subsequent expeditions got into deep trouble with their radio communications. That British one I mentioned got into very great difficulty because they used standard army equipment and it didn't perform well at all on the ice cap. And I think part of it is the resistivity of the ground is very, very high, where you have greatly sub-zero temperatures and frozen snow on top. It's an insulator, you know. Very difficult to get a good ground unless you lay out a counterpoise. I hope that goes some way to answer your question, Phil.
Yeah, thank you very much, Richard. Yeah.